As we were just talking about with Maha, to celebrate the amazing things that you all have been doing with respect to OER in the state of Maryland. I'm MJ Bishop, director of the Kirwan Center, which you've heard me say before is leading the MOST initiative in collaboration with Maryland Online, the Maryland Association of Community Colleges, and the Maryland Independent College and University Association. We're so thrilled to have this opportunity to work with you on these important initiatives. If you had the chance to hear Angela DeBarger's plenary talk yesterday, or Jerry Hanley's talk at our second summit, or if you go all the way back to our first summit and had the chance to hear David Wiley and Cable Green, you already know we've been incredibly fortunate to have amazing keynote speakers for these events who have shared their vision for the future of teaching and learning that's both challenged us and inspired us to do better. So likewise, you're in for another treat now. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maha Bali, who is Associate Professor of Practice at the Center for Teaching and Learning, Center for Learning and Teaching, an important distinction, we'll put learning first, at the American University in Cairo. She's a PhD in education from the University of Sheffield in the UK, is co-founder of virtuallyconnecting.org, a grassroots movement that challenges academic gatekeeping at conferences, and is co-facilitator of Equity Unbound, which is an equity-focused, open, connected, intercultural learning curriculum. She writes and speaks frequently about social justice, critical pedagogy, and open online education. And as soon as I get a minute to pause, I'm going to post all of those links in the chat so that you can connect to some of that amazing work that she's been involved in. I had the pleasure of hearing Maha speak for the first time at the Open Ed conference last fall, and as noted in the session description, Maha's talks are an exercise in imagination that will challenge us to explore how open pedagogical practices can transform the way we think about an inclusive, transformative pedagogy for marginalized communities. In addition, Maha's highly interactive talks model best practices for the way we can accomplish all of this, even in a Zoom environment. So really excited to have Maha with us, and please join me in welcoming her to the MOST Summit.
Thank you. Thank you, MJ, for this wonderful intro. Hello everyone. I just put in the chat, my computer wants to update. Like they always want to do it at the weirdest times, these computers. But this is a link to my slides, and I'm gonna start screen sharing now. And yes, expect this to be interactive, so I hope you guys are in the mood to type a little bit in the chat, and I may even ask you to unmute if you're comfortable. All right, so this is me. A lot of what I'm talking about today is based on an article I co-authored with Catherine Cronin and Rajiv Jangyani, and the link is in that first slide. So I start with Assalamu alaikum. It's a different time of day, different parts of the year, but when you say Assalamu alaikum, that works for any time of day. And I want to ask you, how are you feeling today? I think during this pandemic, I've just gotten used to always asking people, how are you feeling? Because it's a roller coaster of emotions. So let me know in the chat, how are you feeling? Grand, okay. Hopeful, tired but excited, tired. Shalom. Fine, grateful to hear you. Glad it's Friday, ready to relax. Better, tired, doing well. It's Friday, yeah. Should always do keynotes on Friday. People are gonna feel good that it's Friday, right? Excited and energized, inspired, splendid. Awesome, ready to be done with the week. Energized and excited, all right, great, thank you. I'm very excited to talk to you all. I've had not a great morning, but this is the best part of my day right now that I think I'm looking forward to. So, blessed. Thank you. All right, and if you need to stretch or get a drink, I always have something hot to drink and some water beside me because I'm going to be talking a lot. And I've just recovered from a non-COVID cough, so sometimes I might need to pause to cough. I'll be back very soon after that. All right. Again, the slides are here. You can comment on them now or after the event if you want, if something comes to you later. And I just want to acknowledge that keynotes appear to be the work of one person, but they're really the work of a lot of people. I'm inspired by a lot of people, and I'm going to try to mention some of them here as I go. And what I'm going to do is today we've checked in. I'm going to do a chatterfall exercise where I ask you to reflect a little bit on why you're here and what you've learned so far in the conference. And then I'm going to focus on modeling this typology of open educational practices that we developed, Catherine, Rajiv, and myself. And I'm going to go through some examples and applications, and I want to hear from you as well, your applications of this model. How would it apply to the work that you're doing with openness and the work you've heard about this week? And then we're going to end with an exercise, uses pen and paper. You put your eyes away from the screen and you start reflecting on your own, and then we'll share back some of that, hopefully, inshallah. So the chatterfall is just type in the chat as I ask these questions. And the first question is, I came to this conference too, and I'm going to mute and take a look at what you guys say, and I'll start reading out some of it. Be inspired to share and learn as much as I can about OER, gain resources, hear about the great work, gain new ideas, connect with others, find solutions, learn more, share my experience, rediscover motivation. That's an important one. Learn about ways to promote equity in OER. Gaining inspiration again from others and become comfortable. Community. Brings more back to your own campus and recharge. Those things are really important in terms of like this affective element of being in a community of people who think about the same things. Critically examine the connections between OER and DI. That's really important. Spend my knowledge, nuances, new ways to think, grow our fellowship. Working and learning with others. Determine the evolution of other institutions in comparison to my own. That's very specific. Lend support to offer encouragement to OER creators and learn from others. Okay. What about this? What has inspired you most at most? This is funny, most at most. What has inspired me at most is at the conference. Pun intended. It was intended, okay. So what has inspired you guys most this week? Well, not this week, in 2 days, but probably feels like it. Angela's talk was amazing. I just listened to it. Work of amazing faculty, how they empower students, how passionate everyone is, progression in OER, tools and ideas, inclusivity, lightning talks. Okay, some stuff has been transformative, statewide work, positivity, Angela again, large community involving students in developing OERs. Yes. Different strategies that other people have similar issues. That's always helpful to know about. Great work from colleagues at other institutions and improving student equity. Yes. Opportunities to grow as an educator. We have common goals and we're not alone. That's really important. I think this question is, I think openness is important because, why is openness important to you? Hey, Apurva, that's you. Hi. I just realized who you were. Flexibility. We grow by sharing. Emotive. Every human deserves access to knowledge. You guys can hear that motorcycle in the background. This is Egypt for you. Cairo. Very noisy even inside the house. I'm on the 8th floor, but I can hear the motorcycle. Access is critical for opportunity. Sharing is actionable. Benefits students and stakeholders. Broadness, access for participation. We need to make the world less competitive. Yes, thank you. Improves you as an educator. Yes, Deb, thank you. True engagement with content for all. Students, students, students. More than just cost saving, I agree. Invigorating to share knowledge beyond the classroom. Okay, and I'm going to share with you a story, and it'll be clear why I'm sharing it later. But it's a story that's inspired my work in general and with openness especially. So the other day, my daughter and I play solitaire sometimes. So obviously solitaire is something you're supposed to play on your own. But when I play it, sometimes on a couch, my daughter just sits on the other side and she plays along with me. And then one day, for the first time ever, she's like, I'm gonna play solitaire on my own. And then I walked by while she was playing it and I discovered something really interesting. She's always used to playing solitaire upside down because I'm the one who's playing and she's just helping me. But when she played solitaire on her own, she set it up upside down so that she could maintain the same perspective that she has. And she didn't realize that as the main player, the cards should be facing a different way. And I realized that because she had always been on the margins of my game, she was seeing the game different. This is how she saw the game. She didn't see it the same way I was seeing it. Like at first, I was like, I laughed and I was like, why are you doing that? And what's that about? And then I realized that no, she sees it differently. And because she's been on the margins all this time, it's really difficult for her to start seeing it the way I do. But then why do I want her to see it the way I see it? There's something special about how she's seeing it, and to keep that perspective. And I wrote about this in the foreword for this book, Voices of Practice Narrative Scholarships from the Margins. But those at the center can never see what it looks like to be on the margins, because the world looks different from the margins. Like when my daughter saw Solitaire Upside Down. And this unique perspective, especially on suffering and in-betweenness, is why we need to have voices from the margins in our textbooks, teaching our classrooms, managing our educational institutions, and representing us in media and government. This is why Kamala Harris matters so much to girls, Black women, Asians, and immigrants in America. And she actually matters to women all over the world and to girls all over the world. Like my daughter loves her so much. Because cognitively understanding systemic inequalities does not prepare you to truly understand the experience of being marginalized. And that is why everything I'm going to say about social justice matters, and everything I say about participation of marginalized communities matters. Is no matter how empathetic and sensitive and inclusive we try to be, if we are not that person from that particular margin, and none of us is from every margin, right? Even within our intersectional identities, none of us is everything. And that's why participation of everyone is in decision making about their own future and their own learning is important. To something Angela also talked about. And so the article that I'm going to talk about by Cronin and Jangiani and myself is about open educational practices. And we're trying to provide an inclusive typology of open educational practices along several axes. These are continua. It's not a duality, it's a continuum along these three axes, because previous definitions of open educational practices or open pedagogy have tried to be reductive and to limit what it means. And we're really interested in making sure that that conversation is expanded and inclusive of different understanding of how people practice open. So that's been important. The other thing is that we talk about the social justice focus and a lot more access. More, not talking just about access. I mean, a lot of times we talk about OER and we focus on economic aspects and access, but there are all these other dimensions, and we can look at every single thing we do and see where it goes on each of these elements and say, maybe this is transformative for one population, but it's actually negative for another population. Or maybe it's fixes a problem and is ameliorative, or maybe it has a systemic impact. So this is what I hope this keynote will help you question and ask these very particular questions about the work you do and the work you see in openness. And also, I just wanted to say that I had worked with Suzanne Kosioglu a few years ago about the concept of the self as an open educational resource. So thinking about openness as an attitude or worldview, beyond the technical definitions of openness, such as open access and such, there's something that Angela, she showed Zaretta Hammond's tree, and talking about worldview as one of those root things that are beneath the surface, but are really foundational to a culture. And I think when openness is within your culture, your worldview is quite different than people who don't have that in their culture. And it takes time to build that worldview and culture. It's not something that is easy. And those of you who are implementing this kinds of thing in your institution, you know that it takes time for people to catch up to the philosophy behind, I think, openness. And some people get it really quickly because it was already part of who they are. And some of the characteristics of an open self is sort of like being an editable person, like your inward openness to change based on interaction with others. Narrating your practice, so not just sharing the products of your work, but also sharing your processes so that other people can learn. And I'm sure a lot of this has been happening in this conference. And making ourselves vulnerable. And Angela also talked about vulnerability. And I think she quoted Brene Brown, knowing that, of course, vulnerability is a different risk for different people depending on their intersectional identity. And this idea of just negotiation of knowledge, the knowledge is not just a polished product, but something that we can keep negotiating together. And Suzanne and I thought of, after we came up with this self as OER, we think maybe open self rather than OER, because OER makes it seem like maybe it's a done deal. And also the focus on connections and community and not just the individual as a self. So these are parts of the way I think about openness in general. And I like Catherine Cronin's definition of openness as a broad descriptor of practices that include the creation, use, and reuse of open educational resources, as well as open pedagogies and open sharing of teaching practices. And these may not involve OER at all. So because open educational practices are so broad and so different from each other, possibly, this categorization sort of helps you think about the different ones and put them in different slots so that you can compare different open educational practices from each other. And I'm just going to pause for a second. This wasn't in the plans, but what are some of the things that come to your mind when someone says open educational practices? Are there examples that you can think of that you would generally consider these are open educational practices? Someone tells you, give me a couple of examples of that. What comes to your mind? Accessibility, okay. Allowing students to contribute to content, yes. OER text that students can interact with, yeah. Collaboration with and among students, right, whether or not it involves OER. Non-disposable assignments, students as creators, practice that take into account the whole person. Flexibility. Shareable materials, my ability to use and remix without restriction, not overly complex. Allowing students to share free textbooks, providing resources that are accessible to all, modification of course content on the fly. I like that one. Make students partners in construction of knowledge. I really like this, partners in construction of knowledge. Discovery and empowerment. Everyone can access without cost or restrictions. Okay. So some of these are still quite OER centric, and those are still open educational practices, and some are not. So what Catherine, Rajiv, and I thought of are these particular ways of looking at it. So an open educational practice can be content-centric, or it can be process-centric, or somewhere in between. And those that are more OER-centered often center around content, but there are others that are centered around process. And then there are open educational practices where the teacher is the one who's doing the open educational practice, and there are ones where the learner is doing the open educational practice. And then finally, there is open educational practices that focus on an improvement in the pedagogical sense, and some are focused on social justice, and of course some are both. And when we talk about social justice again, and I will explain this again, this economic, cultural, and political element of social justice, and whether that change is transformative, ameliorative, which means not systemic, and then neutral or negative. And even pedagogical things can be focused on the cognitive, behavioral, or affective element. And I noticed Angela in her keynote also talked about elements of care and belonging and trust, right? And those are affective elements. And sometimes that's what you're achieving with an OER rather than a cognitive outcome. That's important. And a reminder again that this is a spectrum, not a binary, because we're going to be doing some activities right now talking about all these different possibilities for open educational practices and whether they fall in one place or another. So Nancy Fraser's framework of social justice says, economic injustice is probably the most obvious one because it's giving access to people who wouldn't otherwise have it, but we give them that experience unchanged. So we're redistributing resources and we're restructuring, maybe if we do it at a deeper level. One example is maybe if you think about during the pandemic, when people didn't have good internet, you could either buy them 4G within like one student at a time, or you could negotiate with the government like South Africa did so that the government makes the use of LMS free for everyone. And that's that you've solved it on a systemic level so that not every person who needs has to ask for the help that they need. And then it can be cultural in the sense of you redesign so that minority views are recognized. So thinking about, for example, in the US, the history of Native Americans was previously ignored or erased or, you know, not told from that perspective. And cultural justice would be to reinsert those views from those perspectives and have more diverse views represented in the curriculum. And of course, what I'm talking about would apply to open education as well, is like how diverse are the perspectives that were included in your curriculum, in your OER, and whatever you're doing. And then political injustice is about, to solve that, is you go beyond giving access and beyond just the culture, but those normally who don't have access to the redesign, involving them and giving them equitable representation. And what Nancy Fraser calls that is parity of participation, making sure they have parity of rights, making sure that when you say we're including someone and bringing them to the table, that they feel fully able to participate, that they have the power of decision making. And I think Angela also mentioned this in her talk. So where she was saying, for example, that previously, and I think she was talking about Hewlett previously, they were privileging legal and technical aspects of OER rather than relational ones, and focusing on narrower definitions related to rigor and knowledge and less related to belonging, care, and dismantling systemic justice. And when funders do this, then they sort of change the agendas of institutions, and institutions often don't have a say in how a funder decides to fund their work, right? And Angela also talked about how their vision is about everyone should have access to knowledge and everyone has the right to be creators of knowledge. And this second aspect of creators of knowledge then can support this concept of students creating knowledge, of minorities creating knowledge and being participatory. And my personal story with Angela that I want to share with you is, I didn't know Angela much at all. I had previously worked on projects that other people were working on that were funded by particular OER funders, and they had sort of restrictions that everything you create has to be CC BY, for example. You cannot do this and that, and there's so many restrictions based on the funder's agenda rather than what the people receiving the funding wanted. My story with Angela is that she reached out to me on Twitter and said, I heard that you're doing this work on social justice. I want to support you. Let's meet. And I didn't know who she was, actually. I looked up and I realized who she was. And when I met her, I was sort of expecting that they would have certain framework for how they would support us on particular things, but not others. And actually, it was completely different. She said, we admire the work you do. How do you want to do it? We will support you however you want to do it. Just let us know how you want to do it, and we'll give you that money. And that's what she did with me. And that's parity of participation. I was working with all people of color and global South scholars on a socially just academia project. And she didn't give me any restrictions with the funding. It was a bit incredible, actually, because this is so rare. Anyone who's ever asked for funding from anyone before. And I hadn't even asked for the funding, she offered it. And so for me, that whole experience was very much a kind of parity of participation, that I was able, in me and my group, to decide how we wanted to do our project, and we just went ahead and did it. We had no restrictions from their side. So let's talk about a couple of examples here. So when a teacher chooses an OER textbook, this would be an example of a content-centric, teacher-centric open educational practice with economic justice, because you're offering it for free, right? But it may not have pedagogical or other social justice benefits. The book may not be representative of other cultures, and there's no necessarily say for students in what's happening. We don't know who made that decision. If that was just a white privileged teacher, then there was no political justice there. Another example is when a teacher encourages their students to blog in their own space. This is a kind of open educational practice, and it's more process and learner centric. It's the students who are blogging. But then depending on how much freedom students have to choose what they and how to write, it depends, and there are risks and there's vulnerability. And there was a blog post recently by a student, do I own my domain if you grade it? So if you're telling students you own your space, do whatever you want, but you're actually asking them to do very particular blog posts about very particular things, and then you grade them on it, and then they may get a bad grade if they don't do something that you like, then that's not really as open as you think you're being, right? So can you think of other examples of a content-centric open educational practice? So other than a textbook that the teacher chooses, what other open practices would be content-centric? Whether ones that you've seen today or yesterday, or ones that you worked on yourself. And it can be like, give me very specific examples of them. Videos, yes. And those are not bad things. We need content. It's not like you're going to teach without content at all. Math apps, yeah. And I'm also really grateful that so much of this is free, because when this stuff and podcasts, yeah, when those things are available for free, it gives me more time to focus on building my relationship with my students, right? Showing sample documents. Right, and so these podcasts may be created by the teacher or the student, for example, but they're focused on the content. And then what you do with them beyond that can make it more process-centric if you want. Asking students to choose and present a particular resource related to the course topic, yeah. Assignments, content-specific assignment, activities and assignments, yeah. All right, what about a process-centric open educational practice? When you said interview transcripts, Alex, I think you were talking about content-centric, but I actually think interview transcripts could be process-centric, because it's about the conversation rather than the, unless you actually meant this for process-centric, but I think you wrote it before I said it. So co-creating syllabi and assessment policies with students, yes, that would be very process-centric. All right, the textbook has writings with Indigenous scholars, so that's inclusive of other perspectives, that's true. So that's the process of creating these was process-centric. Students editing text, yes, that's process-centric as well. Role-playing is definitely process-centric. I'm not sure if it's an open educational practice in the sense that it may not be happening in the open, but if it's happening in the open, then definitely. Hypothesis annotating as a class. Yeah, that's a very interesting one because there's content which you're choosing to annotate, but the emphasis is not on the content, but it's on the way students interact with each other around the content. Renewable assignments, of course, could be anything, right? But it's an assignment that has value beyond the class. That's what a renewable assignment is. And it may or may not be process-centric depending on how you would design it. So I'm sure that, Doris, the way you design it, it is a process-centric. Having students share resources from their point of view, yes, that's true. And online discussions are definitely very process-centric. The aim is not to center any person's thoughts, but the discussion itself. All right. And again, these are often a learner-centric is usually a process-centric as well. So all of the ones that you mentioned, I think, would fit into both categories. But occasionally something is process-centric, but not learner-centric in the sense that learners don't have control over what they're gonna put, but it's still the process is more important. So that's a small distinction there. And then sometimes something is teacher-centric because the teacher is the one who's doing the practice rather than the students, right? All right. So I'm going to ask you a couple of things. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of open educational practice, and I want to know in what ways they promote social justice and in what ways they may fall short. And I'm going to cough for a second. Okay, so student-authored textbooks. In what ways might they promote social justice? In what ways might they not? And this is one where I'm comfortable if people want to type in the chat, or if you want to speak up, that's also fine. So student-authored texts. Does anyone want to share? Different perspectives. Ron, what do you mean by different perspectives? Lindsay is saying if students compensated for their work, that could detract from the social justice. If they aren't compensated, that's like labor, right? Yeah. We get the students unique experiences, students feel included and a part of the learning process. Yeah. Providing autonomy to diverse student demographics. So the key thing here is, and allowing them to influence the narrative, is that the point is that your students may not come from a diverse demographic. So if they're students who are not from a diverse demographic, then you're not getting the cultural justice aspect of it. If you're not compensating them, of course, there's the injustice of that. The labor, you're getting free labor from students. And then the other element, students who have more privilege may feel more confident sharing their perspectives. Yes. So if you have a mixture of students, the less privileged students could have their views marginalized, for sure. And the other thing is actually marginalized students who have internalized their own oppression. If you're asking them to go and find open resources to create a textbook, may not find material that is not from a white dominant perspective, but they are used to material not being from their own perspective anyway, and they might still bring in content that comes from white privileged perspective as well. Students who speak the loudest or most persuasive get most of the input, yes. And so if we're only asking students to write rather than represent their knowledge in some other way, then also the ones who write better or who like writing might end up doing more work than if we allow them to express themselves in these different ways. Angela also mentioned Judy Allen. I'm sure a lot of them mentioned Judy Allen. Make them experience democracy in the production of knowledge. Yes, and I think there's pedagogical value of having students experience this, regardless of whether it achieves social justice or not. But I think it's important to recognize the limitations and when social justice might not be happening. And it would be so important when it introduces topics that matter to students and when students have autonomy over which topics to choose. The question is, would you make time to also explain to them about if they are not a diverse population, or if they are a diverse population who are half privileged and half not, do you take time to actually talk about those other issues that we all brought up? And accessibility issues, of course, yes. And that's one dimension of injustice where some people are very focused on, but a lot of people won't necessarily notice. What about Wikipedia editing? If you give your students an assignment to edit Wikipedia, Karen is saying opens the door for discussions around social justice and open licensing and open access. Yes, I agree. Okay, Wikipedia editing. What do you think? Is this something that does promote social justice? Might there be ways in which it falls short? Has anyone ever done it? Has anyone either edited Wikipedia yourself or done it with your students? Awesome, Sophie and Brian, that's great. So someone's saying, yes, it challenges existing knowledge on topics, right? And also that students constructing that knowledge as well. What else? Trying it out this term. All right, does anyone who is trying it or has tried it before want to speak up a little bit about it? So just to let others know who have not done it before. Are you willing to share a little bit of your experience, whether unmute or just type a little bit more? Okay, go ahead, Sophie, thank you.
I'm actually a regional ambassador for an organizing group called Art and Feminism that organizes or helps organizers of Wikipedia editathons internationally in order to help correct the gender gap on Wikipedia and the internet in general. So if you weren't aware, there is a well-documented gap in representation on Wikipedia. The majority of English language Wikipedia editors, even though it's this huge, open source project, tend to be white men, and that has sort of translated to a gap in representation. And I'm going to put myself on mute because I am co-working in a space and there's about to be some sound.
Thank you, Sophie. And yes, this gender gap is one of the issues. So when you do like a feminist hackathon on Wikipedia, that is a clearly social justice oriented initiative. But Wikipedia itself seems like a democratic space where anyone can edit, but in reality, the white male editors can remove a biography that you add for saying that, oh, that person is not, I think, notable enough. And the criteria for what is notable are quite academic. And that means that, for example, Indigenous knowledge is not acknowledged as credible. And so a lot of, so this is besides the gender gap as well, right? But also like if for example, news outlets are biased and they don't report enough about notable women in the world, then when you come to do a Wikipedia article about a notable woman in the world, you may not find as many. And I think it's very important to have groups like what Sophie works with that help you through that process and organizing the editathons. How do you write a Wikipedia article about a woman so that it gets accepted and so on. Ryan, do you want to speak a little bit more to what you were saying in terms of pushback from scholars in the disciplines and that they promote what they consider to be the right perspective? Do you mean within Wikipedia?
Yeah, sorry, I was just unmuting. Yeah, so in my discipline, I'm an anthropologist, but we get a lot of scholars that promote essentially, like Sophie was saying, kind of the white male perspective. And when you write or modify to add another perspective in, whether it's feminist perspective, indigenous perspective, minority perspective, sometimes that will, like you were mentioning, get deleted or changed or kind of marginalized. And I've seen that happen in Wikipedia ones that I've worked with students.
Yeah. And what you're discussing there, I heard there's also some abuse in the back channels of Wikipedia because Wikipedia can only have one article about each topic, right? You can't have like, oh, this is, for example, the topic about the 1973 war, which happened between Egypt and Israel. You can only have one English language article about it. So you can't have, I think within the article, this is the Arab perspective and this is the Israeli perspective. And so what's very funny about it is the data is the same in that article in English and in Arabic, but the story is completely different. In Arabic, in Egypt, we say that Egypt won that war. And in Israel, they say that Israel won that war, which is, of course, we know how history is written, but it's just really funny because when you look at the Wikipedia article in English, you only see one perspective. There's a discussion going on in the background, but you're not seeing that, right? For the most part, you can if you wanted to look. Joseph is saying, done projects with students on social justice and chemistry, and Wikipedia has no information on trans or homosexual scientists, right? And on women in chemistry, there's only a list of names and nothing else. And that's sad. Like you guys had Madame Curie, and that's Marie Curie, and that's just really sad that that has not improved that much. Challenge students to answer why that is the case. I now like the idea of mentioning to students they could be the ones to start the articles. Yes. And the thing is, if you're going to be with them, then you want to make sure that the articles don't get deleted, because it's a very frustrating experience. If anyone's ever tried it, it's really frustrating if you start one and it gets deleted right after. And definitely great benefit in working in community, do this kind of work. And I think it's one of those things that a lot of the stuff that those of us who care about social justice want to do goes against some of the structures, of course, the systemic injustice. That's why they're there. That's why this is happening. And so working in community is what helps us through this. Angela was talking at the end of her, we can't wait for systemic justice to happen. We have to see what we can do on individual levels, and definitely what we can do collectively helps us achieve more and helps us just keep each other going. A lot of you talked about the inspiration and being energized by working with each other. So that's, for me, open education is that I can find other people from all over the world to collaborate with me on something, even if I can't find them at my own institution. Has anyone created alternatives to Wikipedia for these reasons? Nancy, that's a good question. So I was not planning to talk about this, but there is something called FedWiki. It's a federated wiki. This was done, it exists anyway. I think the person who invented wikis in the first place created the technology for that. And the person that I know is Mike Caulfield, who worked on it. And the federated wiki is basically that someone creates an article, but you can create your own version of the article. And so there doesn't have to be just one version of talking about, for example, Marie Curie, but you can have my version of it and Sophie's version of it and Ryan's version of it, so that it doesn't have, so we don't have to fight over what it means, but I can take one of their versions and edit it in the same way that OER is remixable. And FedWiki does that, but it's not been widely adopted. So it hasn't taken place of Wikipedia. And that's an important thing to note. Again, the loudest voices reproduce the most, yes. And the loudest voices are not just loud because they're loud because they have all these historical privileges of being male, white, and so on, and technical people. The certain viewpoints get, yeah. And they get represented as neutral, objective, which I think is the worst thing, is that you think it's objective because it's an encyclopedia, right? And you think it's representative because anyone can edit it, but that's not the case. Nancy's saying you appreciate how the tensions can invite students to think about tensions related to knowledge creation, what counts as new knowledge and why. Yes, exactly. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation because, of course, 10 years ago, the conversation was, why are educators not accepting Wikipedia as a credible source? And we were like, Wikipedia is actually not a bad source in general compared to other encyclopedias. It's quite updated and so on. But now the issue is the bias thing. For things that are less controversial, I think it's still a good starting point for a lot of things. And the editors are important because they make sure that nobody's posting hoaxes, right? Like, so that it matters, but it matters that they don't represent the breadth of the spectrum of human beings on the planet. And that's why participation is important, and participation of those from the margins is important. You have students take a debate stance about using Wikipedia in academics. Oh, nice, Wendy. And it has improved a lot since it began, that is true. And that's why we use it more. But if we use it more, but the editors are still, and they've improved as well, the editor diversity has improved, but I don't think it's reached the level where it's now fully okay. Wendy, do you want to share very briefly about this, if you're willing, whether in text or outside?
Sure. So my students, we were talking about academic integrity, and since it was a basic level class, we have to assume the students don't have that knowledge. And so, I was like, okay, let's talk about academic integrity. Why does it work? Why doesn't it work? And so one of the assignments was that they had to take a position about Wikipedia. They had to say, is it a good source for research? Is it not? And then they had to defend their stance on that. So there was no right or wrong answer for that. It was more, what do you think about this? So if this is your stance, if you're saying it's a good place to find research, why do you support that? And if you're saying it's not, why isn't it? And so a lot of them pointed out that it's a good place to start for research, to find those extra resources, to look, but it's not a valid place in terms of if you're looking for valid research, because you have to make sure that everybody's saying the same thing, not just in Wikipedia. So but I liked it because I gave them the choice to pick whichever stance they had. I didn't tell them you have this stance, you have this stance. They chose the stance that they wanted to take, and then they had to defend it.
Cool. Thanks for sharing, Wendy. And Sophie, I agree. It's a great start into information literacy. It's something that they all use, and it's a good place to start talking about. Okay, so I'm going to move on and try to see what examples of openness used for different justices that you've experienced. I'm not going to mention economic justice because that's an obvious one, I think. You know, obviously anything that you offer students for free is an example, I think, of economic justice. But although I saw a question someone asked Angela the other day, is like, if people don't have access to devices or internet, then having the stuff for free isn't helpful because they don't have the device to open it on. So that's obviously important to keep in mind. Have you seen examples of openness used for cultural justice? So one of you earlier mentioned a textbook that has indigenous viewpoints, so that would be one example. Do you have other examples? Other examples of cultural justice used in open education? Where minority cultures are well represented in an OER or in a space? Replacing imagery with lots of variety of cultures, yes. Yes, oh my God, when my daughter is only 9 and she notices these things like crazy. Like she'll notice, oh, why is everyone white in this picture or something like that. Yeah, so definitely replacing photos. Yeah, Jinx, you both said the same thing. It's cool. Because you're typing, so you're not looking at what other people are saying and just probably click at the same time. Anyone else? Do you see anything else similar? This is one of the good things about the adaptation element of OER, right? Is that even if someone has done something that only represents one perspective, you are able to then take it and change it before you start using it yourself. We had a discussion about the BLM movement and Blue Lives, All Lives Matter. So that discussion in itself, especially if there are diverse people in it, is an example of an open practice that is culturally just, hopefully. Images, I've been working on images, but also adding name and place names to math problems. And one of the things with math problems, like I work at an American university, so we get textbooks from the US, and they sometimes have like baseball examples for math word problems. And those are not very socially just because we don't play baseball here. So students get, of course, they could probably, if they understood what the math problem was about and forgot about the aspect of the baseball, they would manage, but they hear the word baseball and innings and outing, and I don't know what the words are, and they get confused. And so definitely things that replacing things in math problems to make them more fits someone's culture, making them more culturally relevant is really important. Community created resources, Alex, yes. And that's also community created resources would also have an element of political justice, especially again, if there are minorities contributing and contributing in an equal way. Not just as a token, one or two diverse people. Considering what diverse images are only described for visually impaired when the diversity is relevant to the content. Yes, of course. And so accessibility is, of course, a huge thing here. And then also, of course, you can use diverse images in a tokenistic manner. So it's really important not to use them in tokenistic manner or to misappropriate and use the wrong kind of image to represent a particular culture. You should add cricket stats. No, but cricket is only played in British colonies. So again, in Egypt, that's not going to be relevant. I mean, Egypt used to be colonized by by Britain, but we don't play cricket either. So you need to play something like football as in soccer that everyone else in the world plays to make it relevant to everyone. Culturally irrelevant math problems for hours. Yes, Mark, thank you. And also, of course, gender discrimination. Oh, you were joking, Deborah. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't get that. Next thing someone's going to say curling, you know, it's a sport that I think only Canadians play. But yeah, discuss connections between the material and culturally relevant topics. Yeah, and of course, the more you just open it up for discussion in itself helps, right? Students will make space for students to call you out on. And there was a question that someone asked Angela, but I can't see who asked that question, about sort of the first steps you can take when creating OER to ensure the materials are not biased or that they represent a broad worldview. And it's a question we should all ask ourselves every time, even when we already represent a little bit. So for example, when I curate material and I try to bring in diverse perspectives, it's easy for me to bring people from the Middle East and Africa. And then of course, Europe and America are always easy, but to get people from South America and Asia is a lot harder. I have to make more of an effort to make sure that I do that. And I'm always doing less of that than I should be doing. What about examples of openness that you use for political justice? Do you have examples of this parity of participation of minorities that you've worked on? I don't know how diverse the population is where you all are in Ireland, and whether that has happened. And right after this, I'm going to mention some examples that I've worked on. And we're almost like, do I have 15 more minutes?
Yep. Yes, you do.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to finish talking in like 5 or 10 max so that we can have room for questions as well. All right, I see people are silent on this one, so I'll give some examples of it. So Angela DeBarger was talking about how important it is that teachers have to ensure that the voices of the most marginalized are included in decision-making about when and how they want to learn. And that's the parity of participation. So some examples from my own practice. I don't know if you guys have seen this book. It's called Open at the Margins. And it's co-edited with Catherine Cronin, Rajiv Jangiani, Laura Chernovich from South Africa, Robin DeRosa, and myself. How do you navigate freedom and safety of speech with OER? That's a great question because I have had some really bad experiences with the open community in terms of that, and I can talk about it later, Lucia. You cannot avoid bias entirely. So Jenny's saying, can you avoid it? Of course not. There's a better way to aware of, yes. I think the better thing is to be, I mean, there was Bina Kandola, who's British Indian psychologist, says there are only two kinds of people in the world: those who are biased and those who are aware that they are biased. There is no person in the world who has no biases, and you become aware of them as you encounter your biases, and as you don't know you're biased against a particular population in a particular way until you have to deal with them, and you realize that you don't know them or you don't empathize with them, or it happens, and being aware of them is more important. Working with them, and that's why parity of participation is important. It's like, I'm not going to assume that if I have a blind student that this is what she needs from me. It's giving her agency to decide how she wants to be treated and what she wants from me and what she wants to bring in and how much support she needs, because sometimes someone wants to be independent rather than get supported, right? I think anyone who has an elderly parent or grandparent and sees them struggle with something, sometimes their choice is for you not to hold their hand when they're struggling. And that's what they really want, because they want to try and they want to use whatever they have left. And so this book that we co-edited, first of all, it's free. So it's got the economic justice element. It's culturally meant to only bring voices from the margins. And one important thing here is not just that the identities of the authors are mostly from the margins, but also that their identities are from the margins, their perspectives are marginal, because sometimes people from the margins, when they become empowered in academia, they become like academics and they become like the dominant white culture. They become indoctrinated into that culture, and their perspectives may just echo the white male privilege. So that was the second thing. And then the third thing is that the artifacts are not peer-reviewed. Again, peer review as a process in itself reproduces white hegemonic perspectives in academia, and it's already quite well read. But what we got is we got their blog posts, their videos, things like that, that are actually more accessible to understand for people and shorter and easier to go through, so that when you look at this book, you can quickly read through a lot of these diverse perspectives, much quicker than if we provided you a peer-reviewed article by each person. And then politically speaking, the editors and the authors are from the margins. We, the editors, are all of us either women or from the global south. And then you also we invited the authors, we chose the authors, and then we invited them. And we invited them to choose an artifact of their own if they wanted a different one than the one we chose for them. Because it's possible that someone wrote something really nice 5 years ago, but now they have a new perspective on it that they'd like to include rather than that one. And a lot of them did that. And we also asked them to recommend other people. And sometimes they did as well. Oh, so we've already said the marginality story, so I don't need to say it again. All right, and so I'm going to stop sharing and read what's in the chat and then come back. And it was with Reba's community. Yes, sorry, I forgot to say that. Okay, all right. I think maybe that gets back to the idea of editable self, which I love. You have to constantly be learning and evaluating, yes. All right, and then another resource I've got here is the community building resources that I co-created with others. I've actually got someone at the door and I'm home alone. So I just need to go open the door, but I'm just going to put this link in the chat for a second and show you the next slide because it says what we did. I'll be back in a second. Sorry about this. My apologies for this. All right, I'm back. A student revisit an earlier piece of writing based on something they've encountered. Yeah, I like that. Power modeling about not just arriving at a fixed point, but knowing things. Thank you, Nancy. I like that. And Joe's saying every semester he lectures about police brutality. Yes, that's really important. And sharing their perspective anonymously is sometimes safer, right? Thank you for doing that as well. All right, so sorry, back to these community building resources. So if you've never seen these before, this was when we went all fully online for the fall last semester. I realized a lot of people who don't know how to teach online, we're going to be teaching on Zoom, not the typical online education of before, and they didn't know how to build community online. So I created this with 1HE and Equity Unbound. It was all about the processes of building community. We were recording videos on how to do something by demoing it so that people can understand, with text to tell you how to adapt it, and for different student cultures and different experiences and different resources. And people from very different countries. So we've got people from Kenya participating, people from Lebanon, people from all over the world have contributed resources to this. And there's also space in it for people to comment on adapting a resource to a different context. And we've had people tell us, oh, this resource is not safe for this kind of population and this kind of thing. And so just by involving diverse people in it, and you know, people even with, there's one person who works with us on this project who has particular disability, so she notices particular things. No matter what we try to do, if we don't involve enough people from these diverse populations, we will never be doing everything that they need or everything that's right for them. And so it's always trying to achieve that. And this project especially feels transformative because it responds to a worldwide need where there's systemic injustice in the insufficiency of faculty development support for teachers who are teaching online. Nobody in the faculty development field like me was ever responsible for supporting every single person in their institution, and then suddenly we were. And so everyone was overworked, the teachers, the faculty developers, and then the students, and in a time of trauma, needed this community building more than anything else. So it felt like there was a clear need for this thing, and working on it and doing it. And you can contribute, but and then this last one is Equity Unbound itself, which is an open course. And one of the things we do with the course, where the authors and guest speakers are always women, people of color, Global South. And those of us who created the course, 3 of us are women, but the people who are joining us, again, a lot of us from marginalized populations, but also room for anyone who's participating in the course to contribute to it and to critique. And when someone critiques it, we take that on board and we modify activities, even if we thought so. And the topics themselves, even though I'm teaching a course on digital literacies, the topics in Equity Unbound are ones focused on the social justice angle of this. So the, you know, bias in algorithms and fake news, and also the systemic issues that it can cause and the political issues it can cause. So meant to always have equity and social justice towards. I think I'm gonna stop. There was something here that I had, if we had time to discuss it, but I'm gonna skip it because we've talked a lot about this. And what I'd like to invite you to do is something called Spiral Journal. If you've never done it before, it's based on the work of Linda Berry. And we start with, can you bring a piece of paper? Do you have a piece of paper handy? I'm gonna ask you to fold it in 4. If you don't have a piece of paper handy, you can just type you know, a Google Doc or a Word document. Okay. And I'm gonna ask you for like 1 minute to draw a spiral in the middle. I'm gonna play some, so just very tightly and slowly, but don't fill up the whole paper, just draw a spiral like this. Okay, I'm gonna play a little bit of music so that you can listen to that while we Okay. And now we're going to use the quadrants on this piece of paper to answer these 4 questions. So the first question is, the most important thing I learned today is, and just take a little bit of time to answer that. Okay, and then the next question is, an action step I can take in the short term is, okay, and then this next one is, a challenge or a question that remains for me is, can you still see the prompts, Alex? Sorry, I think, yeah, I was playing the music and then you couldn't see I'll stop playing the music. Yeah, I could have just run the music on a different window and then it wouldn't have been a problem, but sorry. Kamal, I'm not really sure if I'm numbering the quadrants properly, so I'm sorry if I did that wrong. Which one is supposed to be the first quadrant? Top left, top right? Okay. And then the last question is, after this conference, I'm hopeful about Northeast. Ah, I see. I was doing it wrong. Okay. All right. Has everyone had a chance to respond to these prompts? Okay. If you're willing, would you like to share one thought in the chat after doing this exercise? I hope that the experience of just looking away from the screen was relaxing for you. I'll put the prompts up again in case you want to look at them and decide which one you want to share. Looks like you guys were writing a lot on the paper. It takes a while to type it, doesn't it? Thank you, Jennifer. Your daughter's experience, thank you. Expansively freeing and broadening. Oh, I love the idea of faculty learning community. That's a great idea. Positive and negative considerations. Yeah. This positive negative consideration is really important when you work with others, because sometimes people have a good reason for why they don't want to do OER. They don't want to do it in particular ways. Work with faculty support staff. Yeah, better promote various types of justice. Thank you. That's great. Oh, that's awesome. Yes, thank you, Michelle. The blog post authors are good. Yeah, versus full standards. That's true. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good one about Blackboard resources. Make lectures more interactive and inclusive. Yes. Hopeful about building community. That's great. Ask what the learner needs. Yes. Yes, I like this intrinsically incomplete thing, leaving room for the forgotten voices and evolving ideas. I love how you framed that, Alex. I think I'm going to remember this for a while. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I am going to stop here. I don't know if there's time for questions, but you can always ask me questions. The slides are here. I'm on Twitter. And if you want to give me feedback on the keynote, I never stopped to ask you if I was going too fast or too slow. I usually try to ask that sometimes, but I think I was going too fast to, to stop and ask you that. Thank you.
I think we do have time for a few questions if
Great,
folks would
I'll
like
stop.
to type them in the chat.
Okay. So I'll ask for help with that because they're going so fast right now. That
We'll keep an eye on them. And Annika, I don't know if you spotted any earlier.
I found one by Lucia right now. And I think she said something earlier that I wanted to respond to, but I can't remember right now. But she says the pandemic has catalyzed a meteoric transformation in many access education. What are your thoughts on how OER will change as we move forward? Can you tell me more about what you think in terms of pandemic catalyzing a meteoric transformation? You mean in the sense that everyone had to, all over the world, sort of learn online and so on? I think there were so many opportunities for openness, but Lucia, you can tell me a little bit more about what you meant so that I can answer it.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
So the pandemic has forced all educators in all areas, and I think all over the world, to really rethink how we teach, how do we engage, how do we reach out, and all of this has to be done really quickly in the digital phase. And now, a year in, slowly in certain areas of the world more than in others, we're returning to, or have this idea that in the next couple of months, the next semester, we might be going back to a face-to-face, more personalized model. And my question to you is, I don't think we can go back exactly what it was before. I almost think that it would be criminal, because this forced us in so many ways to look beyond and be better and innovate. And so I just want to hear what your ideas on this are. And my question that I had asked you earlier was, how do you navigate freedom of expression safely in OER? And
yeah. So let's talk about this one for, well, the second question is, we need to move forward and not back. So I agree with you. We can't go back and just keep doing things the way we were doing them before. I think one of the biggest ways that OER can help us as educators beyond is not having to worry about the content, so that we can focus on our relationships with our students and the processes of learning. So one of the things that I've been trying to encourage our teachers, for example, when they had to move online, is they thought it was not okay to share videos with each other, even though they were teaching the same course. And I said, actually, yeah, let one person record chapter 1, another person record chapter 2, share it. Why don't everyone who does like lab experiments share the videos, so that not every single person has to record their lab experiments? In biology and chemistry, it's not really contextual. You do this, you put this on top of that and you get this. Like, why aren't people sharing that? So I think hopefully there will be more funding to do that kind of thing and to share it openly, so that people can then focus on what they can do to teach individual students and make that relationship and focus on that, so that they don't have to worry so much about the content. And I think the more people are able to create OER that is, and people have digital literacies to be able to edit them, then they don't have to start from scratch, and they don't have to, I saw there was one of the talks was about, making OER, the interactive elements of OER that commercial textbooks have. We need to work on those as well, so that people don't need to stay tied to commercial textbooks. Now, the other question about this freedom of expression, I think one of the issues with open educational practices, and even within the open community, I have had situations where, as a woman from Egypt, in a community conversation, my word has been dismissed and ignored. And the white males are having these conversations together and not including them, including all the marginalized people in the group, even though we speak up and say, and they don't care if they're offending us, because they're just having their own little conversation. But the thing is, this freedom of expression, as someone who comes from Egypt, where it's very risky to express particular things, is an issue outside of education itself, a problematic thing. And one of the things is that you want to create safe space for freedom of expression within your classroom, but you cannot necessarily even protect your students from each other. There might be someone in the class for whom it's unsafe for another person to speak about certain things. So I think it's a really difficult question to answer. And because it's got so many systemic issues outside of your control as the teacher. I think within issues that within your control and within your power, you can try to also have smaller conversations with smaller groups and letting people know ahead of time what we're going to talk about so that they can prepare and decide, because sometimes you say something in the moment that is risky for you because you didn't prepare for it. And so doing something like this spiral journal activity gives someone a little bit more time to think of what they want to say or think, and then decide what they want to share, and then they can be responsible for what they've said, versus when you say something spontaneously. So this freedom of expression, I don't know if I've really answered your question, but it is risky to speak freely about certain things in certain communities within certain populations. And the existence, just merely the existence of certain people of certain identities can be problematic, especially if they behave with their privilege, like right out there on their sleeve, right? Sorry to if I don't know, thank you. I don't know if I've answered it all. Okay. Oh, that's a great point about visually impaired students. Are they more inclusive when they're digital? Joseph, I'm not really sure if you're saying when you do them digitally, are they done in ways that are more inclusive or less inclusive?
When they're digital, like the American Chemical Society, for example, has removed their paywall for virtual labs, as well as other companies. And so they are able to do these labs with assistance if there's anything visual or reading software. But if you were doing something in a wet lab, mixing chemicals or something, if you were blind or mostly blind, there's no options. Right.
And you're asking me if I have suggestions, and my suggestions is work with blind chemists and blind students to redesign this. They have found ways. I know a lot of professors who are visually impaired to some extent, and of course, they're not all visually impaired in the same way. So of course, some of them can see a little bit that sort of allows them to do certain things. So I think you would actually need to work with a diverse array along the spectrum of visual impairment so that they can say exactly where the barriers are and how to fix them. So I don't know, because I'm not visually impaired. I work with people who are, but not on their lab work. I know with technology, some things that stand in their way, right? Is that a publication on that, Cassie? Cassie just put a link, which I think is probably relevant.
Oh, that's a great link. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Maha, I don't see any other questions at this time.
Someone sent me a private message thanking me for delivering this presentation on my weekend. So thank you. Thank you for recognizing that. And I'm happy to be with you on my weekend so I can focus versus on a work day. All right, thank you all so much. And I think, MJ, you're up next, right?
I am up next, but before that, let's give Maha a round of applause and thank her for, as I told you, it would be an amazing presentation, interactive, and boy, I'll tell you, the time just flew by. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
It was a great kind of final emphasis on, the practical application of many of the things that we've been talking about for the last 2 days and the ways that we can be thinking differently. So thank you again.